Further fatal problems with the Apollo missions. First of all, heat. The Apollo astronauts were supposed to have worked, walked around, hiked around, literally run around in 250-degree heat. That's how hot the surface of the moon gets. It has no atmosphere. The moon has no atmosphere to mitigate the blazing rays of the sun. We're talking about oven-type heat, hotter than boiling water. So at the end of the day, these astronauts are supposed to have climbed into this lunar module, which is doing nothing but sitting there soaking up the sun. All right, at the end of their workday. And I say workday because the actual day on the moon lasts 2 weeks. So there's no respite from night for 2 weeks. So literally the lunar module is just sitting there soaking up the sun. It would have to be an oven when they go in there to try to sleep. The lunar rover, what kind of magical car is this that can stand 250-degree heat? And how can the astronaut just sit on this thing? All of these materials would be getting up to 250 degrees. Imagine a car in our summers on a hot summer day. Remember how hot that is. This is over twice that heat, because I mean, on the Earth we're talking, something like 100 degrees. This is twice that heat. The lunar rover, this is the operations handbook, states explicitly that you can't operate this thing over, well, here operating temperature at maximum 125 degrees. The survival, whatever that means, like the car would croak, 140 degrees. This, by the way, is for the battery. But you can imagine that the entire car is not designed to withstand 250-degree heat, because what vehicle is. These are the Hasselblad cameras that the astronauts used. They're very fine cameras, but they're essentially just slightly modified versions of commercial products. Earthly cameras, not designed to withstand huge amounts of heat. The modifications were minor, like larger controls, so that the astronauts could flip these things in with their gloved hands. These cameras were not totally redesigned. They were essentially like that. And like any other ordinary camera, they had internal gears and delicate mechanisms, some plastic parts. Okay, all of these things would be adversely affected by 250-degree heat. These things are precision little mechanisms, and the plastic would start to melt. The lenses, like any other lenses, are closely fitting in these metal and plastic rings. All right, all of these things are not designed to withstand extreme heat. This is a regular camera, a Canon camera, and the specifications sheet says that maximum operating temperature is 113 degrees. Here's a Nikon manual on temperatures, and it says Nikon cameras are designed to work under specific operating temperatures. These temperatures are between 0 and plus 40 degrees centigrade, which is 104 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the kind of temperature that cameras are designed to work in, maximum, a little over 100 degrees. Same thing with TV cameras. These are the TV cameras that the Apollo astronauts allegedly used. And here's a couple of them, one there and one there. And here's the still camera, the Hasselblad, by the way. All of these are sitting there soaking up heat up to 250 degrees. Remember that. And here's the TV camera operations manual. It says explicitly, the camera should never be allowed to reach a temperature colder than that or hotter than 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, the astronauts themselves are supposed to have been in air-conditioned suits. These suits are supposed to have been air-conditioned with tubes flowing with water flowing through them. Okay, that was supposed to be their air conditioning. However, there's no evidence that this actually worked, because this is a closed system. You have to expel that heat. Just like in a room with an air conditioner, the heat has to be taken out of the room. A hot car, you have to expel the heat through some medium, okay? Air in normal air conditioning, or liquid. This is a closed system. You can't have air conditioning without an escape of the heat. And there's no evidence that anything ever escape. The liquid, that was heated by the astronaut's body. All right, there was never any evidence that anything was ejected out of this suit. Here's what Ralph Renee says: if they had really had suit air conditioners that worked, every time the suit was vented into the high vacuum of space, the rocket effect should have been spectacular. A rapidly expanding fog of ice crystals, that's what NASA says, it's more likely to have been water droplets or steam, would have reflected the brilliant, unfiltered sunlight, spraying millions of tiny diamond-like crystals about and producing a brilliant, dazzling, and unforgettable display. We can be sure our astronauts never released water in this manner, since not one of the thousands of pictures taken on the moon has ever shown such a display. This is sort of what we would expect to see. In this case, somebody tosses hot water into cold air, but whether these would be ice crystals or water droplets, steam, whatever, you would have seen something like that shooting out of the astronaut suits on the moon. But we never saw anything of the sort. Overall, NASA never explains in a serious, believable manner how they dealt with 250-degree heat. Look at this lunar module. It is laughable. It is literally laughable. This is supposed to be a spaceship. What is with all this junk? Okay, and the haphazard manner in which it's distributed. Okay, they say, well, we have to have reflection, to reflect the material, to reflect heat. Well, why is this dark? Okay, and why is this light and this is dark? Well, everything is haphazard here, arbitrary, totally, it looks like a bad high school project. Look at the fit and finish. There is no fit and finish on this thing. Everything's warped. It looks like, you know, a poorly constructed thing, to say the least. And critics have had great fun with this. NASA claims they went to the moon in this pile of shit. All right? And if you zoom in, you can see foil, tape, and curtain rods. Literally, these things are for all the world, like the curtain rods our family would get in the 70s from the department store. All right? That looks like a cheap curtain rod. And what is this? Foil or paper of some sort. And that's tape, a Scotch tape. What nonsense is this? This is supposed to be a spaceship. Look at the lack of neatness, you know, no, as I said, no fit and finish. Warped panels, paper. This is supposed to be a precision rocket or a set of rockets to, you know, guide the spaceship through space with extreme precision. This guy says it all. What the bleep are these? Blow dryers? So, you know, parts you need to build your own spacecraft. Lots of big sheets of cardboard, a big roll of paper, a few old curtain rods, some floodlight holders, an old TV antenna, a roll of gold foil, some small plastic and rods, a few used egg cartons, and lots of Scotch tape to hold it all together in the hostile environment of the moon. Now look at this here. This is the ascent stage. This is the descent stage. The lunar module is in 2 stages. This is the rocket that brings it down to the surface, and then there's a rocket in here which is used to blast off from the surface of the moon. And only the ascent stage, the top half here, the cabin with the astronauts in it, leaves the moon, and it leaves this behind. So this is that ascent stage. This is Apollo 16, supposedly orbiting the moon, or going back up to meet the service and command module. And this photograph is taken from the command module by the astronaut that's left up there orbiting, while the other 2 are on the surface. What on earth is this? Look at this. I mean, this is ridiculous. That's supposed to be a spaceship. That's supposed to be a precision machine. It's a bad joke. Okay, so you say, well, it's suffered some kind of damage. Yeah, but still, it looks ridiculous. I mean, you know, my vocabulary is limited when it comes to these descriptive terms. It's farcical. How's that word? Farcical. The lunar module has been described as a piece of junk, looking more like a homeless person's shelter or a cardboard shack in a Brazilian favela than a spaceship. Gerard Wisniewski says, it looks more like a slum dwelling after a hurricane than a vehicle suitable for traveling in space. Compare that lunar module, that joke of a spaceship, to this actual spaceship, which is the DCX. This was developed in the late 1990s It was designed as a reusable spaceship to go up into Earth orbit and come back. And look how nice and neat it is, and aerodynamic, and well constructed, apparently. Compare that to this thing. Now, of course, NASA will say, well, you don't need aerodynamics in the vacuum of space, and in the vacuum which is the surface of the moon, which is true, but still, we're not just talking about aerodynamics, we're talking about something reasonably professional looking. Further evidence that this whole thing was a joke is that they never actually landed this machine on the Earth, much less the moon, in training. Okay? The first use of that lunar module was the one Apollo 11 landing, the actual thing. There was never any practice run. Whoever heard of such a complex, such a important piece of machinery not practiced on beforehand? This is what they trained on. The Lunar Landing Training Vehicle, or another term was the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle, which is nothing like the lunar module. So in other words, they never did train on the lunar module. This thing here operates on jets, not rockets. It's nothing like the lunar module. Supposedly an astronaut or somebody training with this thing. And as a matter of fact, that machine crashed a number of times, including once with Neil Armstrong flying, and he barely escaped with his life. Here he is parachuting from this thing after it crashed. So here's what Dennis Cimino says about Grumman's lunar module plans. Grumman was the manufacturer. I looked at these drawings extensively. The designs are completely and wholly inadequate. Anybody with any physics and design background would take one look at it and dismiss it offhand as being foolish and goofy. Bill Woods, another engineer, says about the lunar module proposal from Grumman, a 110-page document for a $6.9 billion program is an outrageously small document. There's no way that a reviewer could determine whether or not the contractor is going to accomplish anything worthwhile based on 110 pages of documentation for that size program. Programs of similar size and cost are tens of thousands of pages long. He continues, you wouldn't need a very long proposal if you weren't really going to build a lunar module that really had to work. A 7,500-pound thruster, and of course it shoots out a flame, okay, or a plume. Here it is, the ascent stage blasting off from the moon, and not the slightest hint of a rocket. There's a still photo. No rocket whatsoever. And not only did the lunar module produce no flame, it produced no sound, which is even more unbelievable, because there definitely, without question, would have been a whole lot of noise involved with these rockets. So this, by the way, is when the thing takes off. There would have been explosions, which I'll explain in a second, but there is no such thing recorded in the audio recordings. And in the famous descent of the Apollo 11 lunar module down to the surface, there was no sound at all. You can listen to this and you will hear no rocket noise, just the astronauts' voices and Houston. So this is what Gerard Wisniewski says. And here he's speaking specifically about when the ascent stage of the lunar module takes off. He's talking about this point right here, at this point right here. Explosions would cause the module to shake when the ascent stage breaks away from the landing stage with the help of explosive charges. When the abort stage button in the cockpit is pressed, the bolts that have been holding the landing and ascent stages together are released. At the same moment, knives driven by explosive charges cut through the various cables and leads. With all this going on, the lunar module should have been trembling violently. Werner von Braun says, at x-4 seconds, a thunderous rumble will sound in the passenger spheres. The rocket motors have started. In many of the Apollo recordings of both the descent to and ascent from the moon, I have not listened to all of them, this is me speaking here, there is almost complete silence except for the astronauts and Houston's voices. There is no significant background noise from the rocket engines or any other source. The Apollo 11 descent is infamously quiet. The Apollo 16 ascent is one partial exception. There was a slight explosion. Of course, in a real moon landing program, all of the descents and takeoffs would be very noisy events. Regardless of the vacuum in the lunar environment, and therefore no possibility of sound outside of the spacecraft, the inside of the lunar module is filled with air and therefore sound. Furthermore, the structure of the spacecraft itself would transmit the vibration and sound of the engines. In the NASA report on the Apollo 13 explosion in the supply model, and that was the famous explosion that derailed the Apollo 13 mission, it says all three astronauts heard and felt a pretty large bang. And one of the astronauts, Lovell, says, we all heard the explosion together. So there definitely would have been sound associated with the rockets of the lunar module. Here's the ascent rocket. It's inside the cabin, as shown here. Here's the astronaut, literally a foot or two away from the engine. Although the astronauts in the lunar module were only about 40 centimeters away from the running rocket engines, there is no engine noise to be heard in the background to the radio communications. Okay, so that was the ascent rocket. Here's the descent rocket, and it's also within the structure of the lunar module. If not sharing the air of the lunar module, it certainly is connected structurally to the lunar module in general, and therefore it would transmit vibrations and sound. Now, many researchers say that this rocket should have caused a crater on the moon, and there's never any such crater. The NASA rebutters say that the rocket wouldn't have had to be that strong because of the moon's 1/6 Earth gravity, and there's some plausibility there. So let's say for the sake of argument that a crater is not a necessary result of that rocket. Okay, well, at least, and it's a very powerful rocket, 10,000-pound thruster, at least you would expect that the sand, the dust and sand and loose dirt would be blown away, all right? That there would be some effect of that rocket. But in the photographs of the lunar modules right underneath them, after landing, in all of them, there is not the slightest indication of that rocket actually having been used, having been blasting the surface. All of the dirt is undisturbed. The dirt is undisturbed. And you can see that nothing is blown away because the footprints of the astronauts, okay, are clearly visible there. And so it wasn't blown away. The dirt was not even blown away. So not only did the rocket produce no crater, which we'll grant as a possibility, it didn't even disturb the surface at all and didn't blow away the dirt, which is unbelievable. Now compare that lunar module to this, the DCX, which produced a flame. It made a lot of noise when you watch the videos of this thing taking off, and it also produced small craters in the desert, in the surface of the desert where it landed. So much so that their project designers were afraid that the thing would tip over because it would land unevenly in the crater that it made. So the DCX produces flame, noise, a small crater. Apollo lunar module, nothing. Another problem with this alleged spaceship, it is extremely ungainly. It's top heavy, and it only has one rocket. So in this illustration, this here would represent the one rocket lunar module, and this would be a much more efficient design, more effective. This easy lander would be much easier to control. First, it isn't tall and skinny like the Falcon 9. The center of mass is much closer to the main thrusters so that they wouldn't exert as much torque to change the rotational motion. On top of that, there are multiple thrusters so that you could vary the thrust to create zero torque if you wanted. So this is the design of the DCX, broadly speaking. It has 4 rockets on its broad base, at each corner of its broad base. That gives it a whole lot more stability and maneuverability. And as a matter of fact, unlike the lunar module, this was actually tested successfully. It takes off, all right, and lands successfully. They did a number of tests of this thing, and it worked. Now, we can ask, why on earth are they testing this thing? Why are they having to design a new rocket and a whole new rocket design if Apollo had worked so well? Why wouldn't they just continue using Apollo? The high center of gravity lunar module has been deemed inherently unstable in its vertical axis by engineers. Such a machine would have been nearly impossible to balance with the heavy lunar rover stored off-center. Any slight inertia going sideways would be difficult for the reaction jets to correct. The lunar module could be stabilized with modern computers, but these were not available in the 1960s. Ralph Renee says, "How do you land an unwieldy single-jet vertical landing machine that's unbalanced?" So, to sum up, this thing here was not a real spaceship. It didn't ever land on the moon. It was a large stage prop. Now let's look at this trip to the moon as a whole. It was extremely complicated. There were in this diagram here, there are 134 separate steps. Now, Wernher von Braun had proposed building a space station before going directly to the moon, and that would give the astronauts, NASA, a lot of experience, playing around in space, basically. But no, NASA decided to go directly all the way to the moon. Nothing like this had been done before. Nothing remotely like this had been done before. Just blasting off and getting into orbit and coming back down is a much simpler procedure. There's no way I'm going to go through all these steps, especially in this complicated diagram. So we'll look at this simpler diagram. And even here, there are 20 separate steps. So to get a feel for, just how complex this whole operation was, we're going to go through these steps. So you have blastoff, and then the first stage separates, then the second stage is ejected, and so you're left with a third stage. And then this stage fires to get the spaceship out of Earth orbit and on its way to the moon. And then, after that, there's a complex little operation, a little maneuver, where the service and command module, that's the command module right there, that's the service module. For now, they're like one spaceship. The service and command module comes out of that last stage, does a somersault, and then connects with the lunar module, which is inside here, and then pulls out with it, so that you have the combined service command module and lunar module together. And then after that, okay, that's this operation here. And then after that, they jettison the rocket stage. Okay, so here they are. They do a mid-course correction, and then they get closer to the moon and they do a burn for lunar orbit insertion. And then once they're either near the moon or in orbit, they separate. The lunar module separates from the service and command module. And then the lunar module descends, and then it lands. And then after the astronauts have done all their running around and exploring and all, then you have liftoff of the ascent stage from the moon, leaving the descent stage behind. And then you have a rendezvous where the lunar module redocks with the command and service module. And keep in mind that none of this has been done before Apollo, the first Apollo that went to the moon, which I believe was Apollo 8. None of this had been done before in full. Okay. All right, the lunar module is jettisoned because it's no longer needed. They do a burn for a mid-course correction, and then once they get close to the Earth, the service and command module separate, and the service module, they get rid of that. So then you have the command module, and then it goes into the atmosphere. And this is a very, very tricky procedure here, because it has to come in at just the right angle so that it doesn't either destroy itself with too much friction, too much heat, and too many G's, too much gravity, or it could skip off. If it comes too shallow, it can skip off the atmosphere and end up in space, outer space. So anyway, so they do that, and then finally splashdown. So in this simplified model, you still have 20 separate, delicate procedures that have to be done precisely. Bill Kaysing, citing a 1959 Rocketdyne study, noted that the statistical probability of humans getting to the moon and back is 0.0014. That's just a little over 1 in 1,000. He says there were 85 separate maneuvers involved in each lunar landing. The statistical probability of complete success 6 times in a row without a single failure is practically 0. And here he's talking about the 6 times where they landed on the moon. Overall, they went to the moon 9 times and came back successfully. The only glitch was Apollo 13 with that explosion, which ended up being a success story anyway. And really, they undoubtedly did it for drama more than anything else. The whole thing was a show, and that was part of the show, and that just added a little bit of human drama. And it was just a success story after all, how they persevered and all that. In real life, for instance, with the shuttle program, you have accidents. They're almost inevitable. You had two huge accidents with the shuttle, the Challenger and Columbia, and NASA lost 14 astronauts. But here's Apollo with 1960s technology going all the way to the moon and back 9 times with not a single loss of life or injury. It was downright magical. But of course it didn't happen, and NASA admits it. In this fairly recent video, Orion Trial by Fire, this NASA engineer, Kelly Smith, explains in great detail how this second generation spaceship, the Orion capsule, is going to go all the way to the moon or other bodies, allegedly, like Mars or asteroids, okay? This is an animation. This ship never actually took off, but that's what it would have looked like. And here it goes to, let's say, the moon, okay, because they intended to go back to the moon according to this project here. All right, and he explains all of this and the spacecraft coming back, just like it did with Apollo, parachuting back. Okay, the whole operation is described as if it had never been done before, as if it was totally novel. Smith describes every stage of the Orion mission, a successor and in many ways a close copy of Apollo, as if it's never been done before. Everything is described exactly as if it were completely novel, as I just said, as if we had not yet gone into space beyond Earth orbit. And there's no mention whatsoever of Apollo, just as if it had never existed. And during this video, Smith describes the dangerous high radiation Van Allen belt zones that the spaceship has to go through. And the video shows this with these garish colors to make it seem, you know, all the more scary, which it would be in real life. And he says, as we get further away from Earth, we'll pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation. Sensors aboard this first unmanned craft will record radiation levels for scientists to study. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space. What more does one need to hear? They have not solved these challenges, okay? And they have not sent people through this region of space. Notice that the first craft is unmanned because they need to study the radiation levels. What is all this about? All this is saying, in so many words, that Apollo didn't happen. And this is reinforced by the words of this guy, Terry Virts, a NASA astronaut, ISS International Space Station commander, who says this: the plan that NASA has is to build a rocket that will be able to launch the Orion capsule to destinations beyond Earth orbit. Right now, we only can fly in Earth orbit. That's the farthest that we can go. And this new system is going to allow us to go beyond and hopefully take humans to the moon, Mars, asteroids, and we're building these building block components in order to allow us to do that eventually. Listen to what this guy says. He's speaking English. We understand English. He's saying that they didn't go anywhere. Right now, we can only fly in Earth orbit. That's the farthest that we can go. How much more explicit can anybody say this? Hopefully, we'll take humans to the moon. And we're going to do this eventually. They have not gone before. That's what he's saying here. And this astronaut, I don't know her name. The video never told us her name. She says, we're really pushing the boundaries in terms of where we're going forward with exploration. This is really the beginning, I think, of human beings leaving low Earth orbit. Are we supposed to believe she never heard of Apollo? No, she knows all about Apollo. She knows it was fiction. She's speaking the truth here. Human beings have not left low Earth orbit. And this is evidenced for showing you many reasons, but this one here is quite compelling. Here is Apollo 13, 200 miles toward the moon, in other words, almost there. 200,000 miles is what I should have said if I didn't. And what do you see? Blue sky in the windows of the Apollo spacecraft, hundreds of thousands of miles away from Earth. They were not near the moon. They were in low Earth orbit. That's all this space program did. They got people up there in weightlessness, acting like they were traveling to the moon. They weren't going anywhere. This is as far as human beings have gotten with their own spacecraft. Now, frankly, alien spacecraft may have taken humans farther, who knows where, but with our own technology, with our own spacecraft, this is the farthest that we've gone. This is, by the way, the International Space Station. Just a couple hundred miles, 250 miles beyond the surface of the Earth. This is how far the moon is. About 1,000 times further. than this distance here. It's an order of magnitude, if not several orders of magnitude, more of a voyage. All right, it's a whole different story, and we've never done that. We're talking 30 Earth diameters distance. That is a formidable venture that we haven't even tried, not even started to try, much less accomplished. This is the press conference held by the 3 Apollo astronauts, Apollo 11 astronauts, once they had returned to Earth from their tremendous journey, right? Look at their demeanor. And when you watch this, the whole press conference, not just photographs, the photographs say a whole lot, but when you watch it on film, it's unbelievable. I mean, it's incredible how downcast they are. They are anything but joyful. Anything but joyful. At this stage, Buzz Aldrin is droning on about some technicalities, and look at Neil Armstrong there. They're frozen in thought for quite a few moments. And this is more or less the tenor of the whole thing. It's just amazing. And these are my notes on the whole thing. The mood is downright funereal, the farthest thing from triumphal, joyful, or giddy you can imagine. The men are extremely stiff, clearly very uncomfortable. There's no fluidity to their speech. It's mechanical and consists entirely of sequential monologues, as if they're delivering scripted parts in a play. There's not the slightest convivial banter between them. There's little authentic detail about the voyage in their talk, except for some technical mumbo-jumbo, nor any spontaneous anecdotes recounting unique experiences, as one would expect in an account of a tremendously exciting, wondrous, and mind-bending experience. Practically nothing in what they say is fabulous or enigmatic. It's all humdrum, unexceptional, perfunctory. Very weird and phony overall. And this is what Dennis Semino says. The body language, the facial expressions. These are men that are under duress. These are men that are not happy. These are men that are very, very displeased with the fact that they're on the spot being asked difficult questions. And they're not just being asked difficult questions. They are living a lie, and they know it full well. Almost most bizarrely, the astronauts claimed that they went all the way to the moon and back and essentially didn't see stars. What they say, that the record on this topic is confused, it's contradictory, it's inconsistent, okay? But broadly speaking, they claim that they didn't see any stars on a space voyage. Now, many Apollo critics look at photographs like this from the surface of the moon, and they see a completely black sky with no stars, and they say, well, there should have been stars here. Okay, that's actually incorrect, because in these photographs, this is in daytime. They're on the surface of the moon, but they're under the sun. They're in daylight. They're using daytime exposures on their cameras, and that means very little light into the cameras. And under those circumstances, there is not enough light to make out the relatively dim stars. That's true. Okay, but that doesn't explain why they couldn't have seen stars with their naked eye. Forget the camera for now, okay? All they had to do to see the stars was raise their visor, which acted as large sunglasses, keeping light out, like this guy did. Here we are, this guy's supposed to be on the moon, and he raised his visor, and they did that a number of times. Okay, and then look away from the sun, preferably get in the shade of the lunar module or a boulder, and you would see the stars. In fact, on Earth, with our light scattering atmosphere, which blocks, our view of the stars in general, you can see Venus in the daylight, if you know exactly where to look. So imagine if we had no atmosphere at all, we would certainly see at least the brightest stars and planets. Now, the astronauts were asked this question specifically, did you see the stars? Okay, they look all confused and hem and haw, and this is what they said. When you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars? Armstrong said, we were never able to see stars from the lunar surface. And then Collins said, I don't remember seeing any. And Dennis Semino says, no matter what NASA wants to say about the contrast levels and the optics, you'd see stars. Let's examine this statement by Collins in particular. Okay, Collins, he was He never was on the surface of the moon. Only these two were on the surface of the moon. He was in the command module orbiting the moon all the time. And he was going around and around the moon many times because the orbit was something like 90 minutes or something. And they were there for well over 24 hours, I believe. Anyway, so he went around and around the moon. And on each of those orbits, he was on the dark side of the moon. That's why they call it the dark side of the moon, the side of the moon away from the Earth and away from the sun, all right? On the dark side of the moon, he would have seen nothing but stars in the sky, all right? When he looked at the moon, it would have been black, but when he looks away from the moon, the sky would have been fantastically full of stars, and it would have been just memorable, to say the least. He would not have forgotten that experience, to say the least. And here he is saying, I don't remember seeing any. It's absurd. It's a lie. It's a blatant lie. Now consider the Hubble Space Telescope. Okay, here it is, photographing the sky, stars, and celestial objects in daylight on the day side of the Earth. And why can it do that? How can it do that? It can do that because it's above the atmosphere. All right, so it's seeing a black sky just like the astronauts on the moon with the space telescope. Is that they use long exposure photography. As a matter of fact, the Hubble Space Telescope takes exposures not just in minutes, but hours and days at a time. And it goes around and around the Earth, like 90-minute, that's about the standard, something like that, on that order. 90-minute orbits, and half the time it's in the day, in the dark, on the dark side of the Earth, the night side, and half the time it's on the day side. But it doesn't shut down when it gets on the day side. It keeps on photographing. All it has to do is avoid pointing toward the sun. In fact, photography of the stars is not a problem during the day where there is no atmosphere to scatter the unidirectional light rays from the sun, as long as one uses long exposure, in other words, night settings. That's all you have to do. The astronauts would have been able to do that on the moon as well, okay, if they had taken one of their cameras and put it on a tripod, if they had taken a tripod, which they would have if they were serious, or just place it on a rock or something and use long exposure settings instead of the day settings that we saw earlier, okay, where they took normal photographs. They could have taken long exposure photographs, and this is what they would have been able to photograph: a pristine, tremendous view of the night sky from the moon without any atmosphere to interfere with the view. They would have taken fantastic photographs. But they couldn't do that because they couldn't fake the sky. They could fake the lunar terrain because we don't know what the lunar terrain looks like. We haven't walked on the moon, but we do know what the night sky looks like. Amateur astronomers as well as professional astronomers, we know quite well what the sky looks like. For instance, in this photograph here, I recognized the constellations. This is Ophiuchus here, this is Scorpius here, and this is Libra here. Okay, and the individual stars, some of them I know, like Antares. These two very bright things are planets. This is probably Jupiter. I'm not sure which planets these are, but the point here is that we can determine where all the stars are and all the planets are or should be, because astronomers can do that. And so you wouldn't be able to fake a night sky. So what did they do, NASA? Since they weren't on the moon, okay, they wouldn't have been able to get it right. They decided no stars. That was the party line. NASA took 3 lunar rovers all the way to the moon, but not one small photographic telescope with which to record the sky from the moon. Astronomers dream about an atmosphere-free moon observatory. The Apollo astronauts, on the other hand, display complete indifference to the night sky. They do nothing but collect rocks. Astronomical observation would have been a high priority in a real scientific mission. To conclude, I have shown you an abundance of evidence, a veritable torrent of evidence, that demonstrates conclusively Apollo was a lie, that we have not gone to the moon. We did not go to the moon with Apollo. It was all just a show. The U.S. government's moon landing program has been called, quote, the crowning achievement of humankind, the greatest boast of the species, the event in human history most associated with pride in our own accomplishments, unquote. That was from one of the videos. It did not happen, period. The plain fact, proven copiously and beyond doubt in this study, is that it was an extremely elaborate hoax, as I believe Dennis Semino said early on. A stupendous lie, a lie on a scale unprecedented in the history of the world. The moon is undoubtedly a fantastic place, probably a very beautiful place in its own way. But it is not a friendly place to visit. It's more like this asteroid Vesta, a dead world fully exposed to radiation and micrometeorites, and not a friendly place to visit. Not like this depiction, which for all the world looks like, people driving around and hiking around in a national park here on Earth. That is phony baloney. NASA's moon is bland, featureless, washed out, insipid, innocuous, sterilized, sanitized, neutered, Disneyfied. In short, a fictitious cartoon version of the real moon. Nothing but a platform for American propaganda. This is what they show us. A smiley face, malarkey moon. A vehicle for American propaganda. Nothing more, nothing less.